I don't think 0% inflation is necessarily better than falling prices. I'd rather see the cost of living go down than stay the same. But, at a minimum, they should target stability, not 2% inflation every year. That's a 2% decline in your standard of living if everything is 2% more expensive. But the Fed can't really target interest rates by monetizing debt, because in order to do that, it creates inflation, which ultimately puts upward pressure on the very long-term interest rates they're trying to suppress. So really, the best way that the Fed could try to create an environment where we have a sound economy with low unemployment and low interest rates is to have sound money, is to fight inflation. But that's the one thing that Trump administration doesn't want the Fed to do. The last thing that Trump wants the Fed to do is fight inflation. Trump wants the Fed to blow air into the bubble so he can take credit for a phony economic boom. And what he doesn't want to have to accept responsibility for is a bust. Even if the bust is cathartic in that, we fix the problems that underlie the economy and we lay a foundation for lasting economic growth in the future. Trump doesn't care about economic growth in the future because he won't be president in the future. And so he wants to take credit for an economic boom. And the only way we can have one is to have a phony one. All we can have is a bigger bubble. And so that's what Trump's fiscal policy is trying to achieve. And that's what he wants the Fed to cooperate. He wants a massive bubble that he can put a big T on. And everybody can think they're getting rich as, they're going broke. Nobody has been a bigger Fed critic over the years than me. I mean, I blamed them before the 2008 financial crisis, before it happened, because I knew the crisis was going to happen, because I understood the monetary policy mistakes that the Fed was making. But be that as it may, the only thing worse than the Fed we got would be a Fed controlled by the president. I think to the extent that there's any independence at all at the Fed, that's better than no independence. I think we should have the same monetary system that existed before the Fed. And before we had a Federal Reserve, the only thing the U.S. government did was coin gold and silver, which is all that's authorized in the Constitution. And to the extent that we had banknotes that circulated, they were all issued by private banks. They were not issued by a central bank, and they were never issued by the United States government. Now, in theory, if we can go back to the original intent of the Federal Reserve in 1913, that's still not that bad. The problem was the camel's nose under the tent. The original Federal Reserve was a private banking syndicate. That's why it's independent, because it was never part of the federal government, because the federal government is not allowed to do what the Fed does. The federal government doesn't have the constitutional authority to print money. Only private banks can issue paper currency. There's no monetary authority in the Constitution for the United States government to do that, so they allowed the Fed to do it. But I never liked the whole relationship between the government and the Federal Reserve, but at least the way the Federal Reserve was originally conceived. In the original Federal Reserve Act, it was illegal for the Federal Reserve to own any U.S. government debt. It couldn't buy it and it couldn't own it. And they changed that, and it still can't buy it. The Federal Reserve is not allowed to buy any treasuries directly from the U.S. government. That's still the case. But it is allowed to buy them in the secondary market, and that's what it does through these primary dealers. But the way the original act was conceived and ratified, they weren't allowed to own them at all. And that's because the Congress that passed the Fed did not want the Fed to facilitate deficit spending. They didn't want the U.S. government to be able to rely on the Federal Reserve to finance debt. And that was very smart. Now, if they were even smarter, they never would have established the Fed, because they would have realized that once that power was there, it would get abused. And it didn't even take long. They amended the Federal Reserve Act shortly after they passed it so that the government could use the Federal Reserve to finance World War I. And so, it didn't take long to corrupt it. But I recognize that if we gave the power of the printing press directly to the U.S. government, they would abuse it even more than the Fed. And so we'd have even more inflation than we do now. There's a lot of smaller companies that aren't as speculative as you think. I mean, if you're talking about a pure exploration type company, because you don't know what they're going to find. Maybe they find nothing. But there are a lot of very small companies that have proven reserves that they just haven't raised the capital to dig up yet, right? They're at the earlier stage. You're not at the exploration stage, although they may be exploring for more, but they have provable assets and they just haven't developed them. So they're not, in production, they're not generating any income. And I think there's some incredible value there because I think these companies are going to get bought up. I mean, it'll be a much friendlier environment to raise capital in the future, and they will be able to raise capital to build out these projects. But I don't think they'll have to, because I think the bigger companies that really have not been investing much in exploration and development, they've just been paying down debt and now they're buying back stock. I think they're just going to have so much cash that they're generating, they're going to have to do stuff with it. And I think it's going to be cheaper to buy out other companies than spend money on exploration and development. I mean, because you roll the dice on exploration, you don't even know what you're going to find. Why do that when you could just buy up these companies and get their whole book of business, right, on the cheap? Look, there's just going to be so much money made, I think, in the consolidation of this industry, which I think is going to happen before there's any really major increase in exploration and, of new projects, which is another reason, the price is going to keep going up. Yeah. Because it's not like when gold is $5,000 an ounce, there's suddenly going to be all this extra gold that's being mined. It's not going to be there. Yeah, there may be some more marginal supply. Maybe Americans will start selling off their jewelry at $5,000 gold to pay their grocery bill, but that's not going to make much of a difference in the scheme of things. And so there's not going to be a lot of new production. And, one of the sources of supply used to be central banks selling. Central banks are not selling. Again, they're buying, and they're going to keep buying, especially these emerging market BRIC nations. They still have, very small percentages of total reserves in gold. Even though they've been buying, they have a lot more to buy. It's just that the major central banks, like, in Western Europe, United States, where we still have a lot of gold, but we haven't been buying, right? The United States hasn't bought any gold. I mean, we're thinking about buying Bitcoin. That's how dumb we are. I don't like centralized government planning. I don't like the governments taking an active role in the economy. I don't like the government picking winners and losers and buying into companies. And so the Trump administration is doing a lot of things that under normal circumstances, Republicans would oppose. I mean, almost everything Trump is doing, if Biden had done it, there'd be universal opposition to the exact same programs. So none of this stuff is going to work. It's all going to backfire. What it does is it leads to a less efficient allocation of capital and resources. It undermines productivity and economic growth, and it leads to higher inflation and a weaker dollar. So all this stuff is bad. And so from that respect, it's going to be good for gold and precious metals because inflation is good for hard assets, especially gold and silver. So when governments screw up, gold does well. I mean, that's why it's almost a can't lose bet, because there's no way the government's going to do the right thing. So if you want a sure bet, you bet the government's going to do the wrong thing. And, given the choice between doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing, they'll always choose the wrong thing. That's why gold's been going up for 25 years. We've just made a series of mistakes that get bigger and bigger and bigger. There isn't a lot of silver out there relative to demand that I see for it in industry, but silver is just cheap, and it's cheap relative to gold. And I think that once silver gets above 50, I think it's going to take off. I think the move from 50 to 100 will be relatively quick. I mean, it'll be a lot quicker than the move from 30 to 50. I mean, why shouldn't silver be double its 2000 or 1980 high? But, and other precious metals are cheap too. Look at platinum compared to the price of gold. And platinum has already had a big move this year, but it's still pretty cheap. So I think we're finally starting to see some of the other precious metals moving. But silver has always had a stronger monetary correlation with gold. So silver is more what people buy, maybe the poor man's gold. And I think that's also part of what's been going on here, is that the central bankers, as the primary drivers, have not been buying silver. They want gold. But when the public wakes up to what the central banks are obviously already cognizant of, the public will buy silver. Then I think silver is going to respond. I think it's a number of things. I mean, the NASDAQ is at new highs, so people are making money on tech stocks, and so they're not worried about buying gold. There was a lot of false optimism, I think, from the election of Trump. I think a lot of gold buyers are Republicans, and when Republicans are optimistic, they don't buy as much gold. It's when they're worried that they buy more gold. When there's a radical left-wing president, that might rile the feathers of Republicans, and they may start buying more gold and more ammunition and more canned food and stuff like that. But if they're optimistic because they think they got this conservative in Donald Trump, they're not buying, even though Trump's not a conservative. He's pursuing the most reckless fiscal policy I've seen, in modern memory, because we don't know if this is going to be a catalyst for a positive change or if it's going to be the opposite. Are we going to go all in on socialism and completely destroy what's left of capitalism and have hyperinflation and a totalitarian society? Look how long Argentina had to sweat it out before they finally elected Milei. And, we could be in for an even darker economic period than they lived through. So I don't know. I can still be hopeful that we'll learn our lesson and we'll do the right thing, but there's no sign of that now. I mean, now we're doing everything wrong that we could possibly be doing wrong. But, we haven't really been forced to do anything right because we've been able to kick the can down the road. We've been able to keep running these deficits, the budget deficits and the trade deficits, to the point where, Donald Trump actually thinks that the world depends on us, that we got him, just where we want him because we consume so much and we borrow so much that we're so important. Well, he's going to be in for a rude awakening when he finds out that it's the other way around, that the world needs us like a hole in the head, that the world is perfectly capable of consuming what they produce. And they're perfectly capable of investing their savings in their own economies. They don't have to loan their money to us. The problem is Americans can't produce what we need, and we don't save what we borrow. So we're the nation that depends on the rest of the world. The rest of the world does not depend on us. And so when we realize that and we get a monetary crisis and a debt crisis, then we'll see. Yeah. But as you mentioned, I do think one of the more interesting anecdotes, whenever they write this history book that includes this period, probably one of the most amusing parts will be Bitcoin and the crypto craze, because that's going to be the new tulip mania. So they're not going to have to go back to the Dutch, in whatever it was, the 1500s, wherever it was, to find a great example of mass delusion and the madness of crowds when it comes to a bubble. They'll have Bitcoin. So that'll be a case study for a long, long time.